The evening started like any other at the busy downtown restaurant, but for one waiter, it would turn into a lesson he would never forget. He had seen all sorts of customers come through the door, rich, poor, well-dressed, and a bit rough around the edges. But this particular night, something was different. As the door opened, a middle-aged man walked in, looking a little out of place. His clothes were simple, a bit worn, and his shoes, old sneakers, made him stand out among the sleek, well-groomed crowd. The waiter didn't think twice. He was used to judging people at first glance. After all, it was part of the job, right? Spotting the big tippers, the ones who'd leave a decent tip, and those who wouldn't. It was an unspoken skill, and he was certain he had it down. As the man sat at the corner booth, the waiter barely acknowledged him. He rolled his eyes and mumbled under his breath about another one of those people who think they can eat out on a shoestring budget. The way the man looked, the waiter assumed he wasn't going to be the kind of customer to leave a good tip. It was a busy night, and there was no time to waste on someone who seemed like a lost cause. As the waiter approached the table, he gave the man the briefest of nods, his attitude already sour. "What can I get you?" he asked curtly, barely meeting his eyes. The man, however, didn't seem bothered by the waiter's cold tone. He smiled warmly, his eyes kind but tired. "I'll have the soup of the day and a glass of water, please." His voice was calm, almost soothing, as if he wasn't in any rush at all. The waiter, already mentally tallying how little he would earn from this table, huffed and turned to get the order. He couldn't understand how some people could be so content with so little. As the evening went on, the waiter found himself serving table after table, each more demanding than the last. It was hard not to feel frustrated. Yet every time he passed by the corner booth, he noticed the man sitting there, quietly eating his soup. He wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't causing any trouble, just minding his own business. The waiter's annoyance grew, and he decided to avoid the table as much as possible. After all, the less he interacted, the sooner he could move on to someone who might leave a bigger tip. But then something strange happened. The man had finished his soup, and he called the waiter over. "Could you bring me the bill, please?" he asked. The waiter almost sighed aloud, his mind already calculating how little he would earn. He handed the man the bill with a forced smile. The man took the check, looked it over, and then said something that made the waiter pause. "You know, I've been coming here for years. I've seen a lot of waiters, but you, my friend, you have a unique style. Not many people act the way you do." The words stung, but the waiter tried to shrug it off. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he said, still thinking that maybe this man was just looking for a reason to complain. But then, the man did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. The waiter's eyes widened. It wasn't the amount he had expected. The man counted out a generous tip, more than enough to cover the waiter's expectations for the night. And then, just as the waiter was about to thank him, the man added one final remark that would stay with him forever. "You know," the man said, "it's easy to judge people by their appearance. But the true measure of a person is not how they look, but how they treat others. You might want to think about that next time." The waiter stood there, frozen. The words had hit him harder than he cared to admit. He had judged this man based on his appearance, assuming he wouldn't be a good tipper, assuming he didn't belong. And yet the man had been kind, calm, and generous. It was a stark contrast to the assumptions the waiter had made. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The waiter's mind kept drifting back to that encounter, replaying the words over and over. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to know who was worth his time, and who wasn't. But now he wasn't so sure. The man's simple words had shaken him in ways he couldn't explain. He had spent so much time judging people based on what they wore or how they looked, never truly considering who they might be on the inside. As the night came to an end and the restaurant began to empty out, the waiter found himself at a crossroads. He had a choice to make. He could continue down the path he had always known, judging, dismissing, and letting his assumptions dictate how he treated others. Or he could take the lesson to heart, open his eyes to the complexities of people, and remember that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the people you least expect. But the question lingered in the air, unanswered. Was he ready to change? Was he ready to see people for who they really were, not just for the clothes they wore or the way they walked into a room? And would that change him in ways he wasn't prepared for? The waiter headed to the back to clock out. A wave of uncertainty washed over him. He glanced one last time at the corner booth, but the man was gone. The lesson, though, was still there, hanging in the air. It was a lesson about humanity, about kindness, about not judging a book by its cover. A lesson that would stay with him long after the night was over. But the real question was, would he remember it tomorrow? Or would he fall back into his old ways? Only time would tell. The next day, when the waiter returned for his shift, he couldn't shake the memory of the man from the previous evening. It had been gnawing at him, a strange feeling settling deep in his chest. The words, "You might want to think about that next time," echoed in his mind every time he reached for a new tray or cleaned a table. It wasn't just that the man had left a big tip, although that alone was enough to make anyone feel a little guilty. It was the way he had looked at him, the calmness in his voice. It was almost as if he was speaking directly to his conscience, and that was unsettling. Most customers came and went without leaving a trace. But this one, he left more than just a tip. As the waiter began his shift, he found himself watching people differently. The way they walked into the restaurant, the way they dressed, the way they ordered their food. It all seemed to carry more weight now. He couldn't stop himself from analyzing every detail. A couple walked in with matching outfits, laughing and holding hands, and he immediately assumed they were the kind of people who would leave a good tip. But then, as he served them, he noticed how they treated the other waitstaff. They snapped their fingers when they needed something, spoke in a condescending tone, and made rude comments about the restaurant's decor. The waiter's initial judgment about them, based on their appearance, had been completely wrong. They weren't the kind of people he would have expected to be so entitled and rude. This shift in perspective started to haunt him. What had happened to him last night wasn't just a simple case of misjudgment. It was a wake-up call. He realized that he had spent years doing exactly what everyone else in the restaurant world did. Sizing people up, making assumptions, and treating people according to what he thought they deserved. He had grown comfortable in his bubble of judgment, never questioning his actions. But now, every customer he encountered made him feel like he was on trial. His assumptions, which had once been so automatic, felt like a betrayal to the lesson he had learned. He wanted to be better, but every time a new customer came in, he found himself slipping back into old habits. By the middle of the day, the restaurant was packed, and the usual rush of customers had arrived. The waiter's mind wandered, and he tried to focus on his work, pushing the unsettling thoughts aside. But when a new group of people entered, 3 young adults in their 20s, laughing loudly and joking around, it all came rushing back. They were dressed casually, not too fancy, but not exactly shabby. The waiter immediately sized them up. They were the type of people who seemed like they had money to burn, but he didn't expect them to be generous. It was always the loud, confident ones who were the least likely to leave a decent tip. He approached the table with a polite smile, trying to push his judgment aside, but his mind was already calculating the potential tip. "Hey there, what can I get you guys today?" he asked, keeping his tone light and friendly. The group was easygoing, chatting with each other while placing their orders. They didn't seem demanding, and the waiter found himself relaxing slightly. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about them. They weren't so bad after all. But then, one of the young men made a joke about the restaurant's prices, poking fun at how much the food cost for a place that didn't seem to offer anything special. The waiter, who had been serving here for years, couldn't help but feel a slight twinge of irritation. It wasn't the first time a customer had cracked a joke about the prices, but this one stung a little more than usual. As he walked away, he found himself questioning why he had even felt that irritation. It wasn't as if the group had said anything too rude, but the thought lingered. Why was he so quick to judge? Why did he assume they would be cheap just because they joked about the prices? He tried to shake it off, but it was hard not to feel like he was carrying around a weight now, a weight that kept reminding him of the man from last night. As the day went on, more customers came and went, but the waiter found himself more and more frustrated with the way he was behaving. Every time he approached a table, a new thought popped into his head. He would judge them based on their clothes, their attitude, the way they looked at him when they placed their orders. He had been doing it for so long, it was like second nature. And yet now it felt wrong. It felt like something was missing. At one point during his shift, a woman in her 40s came in alone. She wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a simple dress and a pair of sandals. But there was something about her. Her eyes were kind, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence. The waiter immediately noticed how she walked, how she seemed so sure of herself, yet not in an arrogant way. He had seen plenty of women like her before, people who weren't trying to impress anyone but still carried themselves with a sense of dignity. And once again, his mind started racing. This time, he didn't want to judge her. He promised himself that he wouldn't. He approached the table, determined to do better. "Good evening," he said, his tone more genuine than it had been all day. "Can I get you something to drink while you look over the menu?" The woman smiled and nodded. "A glass of white wine would be lovely, thank you." As he walked away to get her drink, he caught himself thinking about the people he had judged earlier that day, the loud group of young adults and the woman who had just entered. What made them different? Why was he so eager to place people into boxes based on their looks or behavior? And why was it so hard to stop? The question swirled in his mind, but he didn't have any answers. When he returned to the woman's table, she was sipping her wine and reading through the menu. She looked up at him as he set the glass down, and their eyes met for a moment. For some reason, it felt different than any other interaction he had had with a customer. There was a calmness in her gaze, something that made him pause. He couldn't explain it, but something about this woman felt real. He wanted to know more, but he didn't dare ask. Instead, he carried on with his usual routine, taking her order and returning to the back. But even as he moved through the rest of his shift, he couldn't get that brief exchange out of his mind. Something was changing in him. It was like the more he tried to avoid judgment, the more he realized how deeply ingrained it had become. He had never considered the reasons behind his assumptions before. He had never thought about the people on the other side of the table, their stories, their struggles, their joys. It was always about what he could see on the surface. But now, after the conversation with the man the night before, it felt like he was seeing the world differently. Every person who walked in, whether they were dressed to the nines or looked like they hadn't slept in days, seemed like they carried an untold story. The woman at the table finished her meal and called for the check. As he handed it to her, she smiled and thanked him. "You know," she said softly, "the service here is always good, but I think you've been a little more thoughtful today. It's nice to see." Her words were simple, but they cut through the noise in his mind. Was it possible that people could sense when you were trying to change, when you were trying to be better? Could it be that his behavior had already started shifting, even without him realizing it? As he walked away, the waiter realized that something was different. He was no longer sure of himself in the way he had been before. The assumptions, the judgments, they no longer felt as clear-cut. And as the night wore on, he couldn't help but wonder, was this just the beginning of something bigger, something that would change the way he saw the world, and perhaps, more importantly, the way he saw himself? The tension in his mind had only deepened, and now, it seemed like he was on the verge of a revelation that he couldn't yet fully understand. The waiter couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in him, but it was as though he was walking through fog. He couldn't clearly see the way forward, but he knew he was moving, and it was unnerving. Every table he served, Every person he encountered felt like a test. He couldn't stop himself from wondering whether the changes inside him were genuine or if he was simply trying to convince himself of something he wasn't sure he could maintain. As the days passed, the waiter started paying more attention to the small details. The way the customers interacted with each other, the way they held their forks and knives, how they spoke to the staff. It was all starting to matter more. But it wasn't just about the customers. He was becoming more aware of how his actions were being perceived, how his energy had shifted. He couldn't help but wonder if others noticed. Were his old habits still there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to show up again when things got busy or when he was overwhelmed? It wasn't long before the next test came. A couple walked in one Friday evening, their laughter and bright smiles filling the room as they made their way to a table by the window. They were dressed sharply, the man in a tailored suit and the woman in an elegant dress, the kind of couple that made the room feel like it had more life than it had before they arrived. The waiter immediately felt that familiar rush of judgment creeping in. He couldn't help it. He assumed they would be exactly like the others, the type to ask for things and not offer much in return. He tried to shake it off. He had promised himself he would be different this time. But as he walked over to greet them, he felt the old reflexes rise to the surface. "Good evening. What can I get you to start with?" he asked, his voice a little too chipper, a little too forced. He wanted to prove something to himself, to show he was better than this, but the doubt was still there. The man looked at the menu for a moment before glancing up. "We'll have a bottle of your best red wine, and we'll start with the calamari," he said smoothly, not missing a beat. The waiter nodded, taking the order, but something about the couple made him feel uneasy. It wasn't their clothes or their voices. It was the way they looked at him, as if they were sizing him up. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an undercurrent of tension that he hadn't noticed before. He turned quickly and went to fetch the wine and appetizer, pushing the uneasy feeling out of his mind. But the moment he returned to their table, it became clear that something was wrong. The woman's smile had faded, and the man's expression was one of irritation. "You've made a mistake," the woman said, her voice cold. "This isn't the wine we ordered." The waiter froze, his heart rate picking up. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quickly, trying to remain calm. "I'll correct it right away." But it wasn't the wine that bothered him. It was the way they looked at him, as if they were waiting for him to mess up. There was a cruel kind of energy between them, something sharp and cutting that made him feel small. He quickly returned to the bar, feeling a knot form in his stomach. As he approached the bar, he heard the woman's voice again, raised this time in frustration. She wasn't yelling, but the way she spoke to him felt dismissive, like he was beneath her. The waiter could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the familiar sting of embarrassment creeping in. It was the kind of feeling he had always tried to avoid. When he returned with the correct wine, the couple didn't even thank him. The woman barely looked at him as he poured the wine, her eyes fixed on her menu as if he weren't there at all. He set the bottle down and moved quickly to the next table, trying to shake off the unease. But as he continued to serve the other customers, he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, judged. It was as if the couple had marked him in some way, had exposed him for his weaknesses. It wasn't long before their meal arrived, and with it, a wave of tension that seemed to permeate the entire restaurant. The waiter found himself more and more distracted, his thoughts swirling as he watched them eat. He didn't want to look at them, didn't want to see the contempt they seemed to have for him, but he couldn't help himself. There was something about their aloofness, their disinterest in anyone else, that made him feel invisible. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something he didn't, something he should have known by now. The evening wore on, and the couple continued to demand more than he could give. Each request, each glance, was like a dagger aimed at his confidence. He found himself slipping into old patterns, the frustration, the resentment, the sense of powerlessness. He wanted to snap at them, to tell them to leave, but he couldn't. He wasn't that person anymore, was he? He wasn't supposed to judge, to give in to the anger that had always been so close to the surface. As the night dragged on, he began to feel the weight of everything pressing in on him. The man's words from the night before, the ones about judging people, kept resurfacing. Every time he tried to push them aside, they came back, louder and clearer. He was angry. He was frustrated. And yet, every time he felt the old anger creeping up, he remembered the kindness of the man, the warmth in his eyes, and how it had made him question everything. But now, the couple was pushing him to the edge. They were testing him in ways he wasn't sure he was ready for. He could feel the tension rising in his chest. This was the moment. This was the test. Could he walk away from his old ways, or would he slip back into the same patterns he had spent so long trying to escape? The final moment came when the couple asked for the bill. The man handed over a credit card, and as the waiter returned with the receipt, the woman barely looked at him. "Tip is included," she said dismissively, as though they were doing him a favor. And that was when it all snapped. Something inside him broke, and he could no longer hold it in. He set the receipt down with a sharpness he hadn't intended. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. The moment felt so loaded, so full of unspoken words, that he couldn't bear it any longer. He turned away before they could say anything else, before the anger could completely take over. But as he walked to the back, a part of him knew something had changed. It was no longer just about the tip or the way people treated him. It was about something deeper, something he had to face. The tension in the air was unbearable. He could feel it in every movement, in every glance that passed between him and the rest of the staff. His thoughts were spinning, his heart pounding in his chest. He was standing on the edge of something, but he didn't know what. As the waiter stood in the back of the restaurant, his mind racing, he tried to regain some sense of control. His heart was still pounding, the heat of anger and frustration mingling with an uneasy sense of guilt. The weight of the day, the constant push and pull between his old self and the new, felt suffocating. He could hear the chatter of the kitchen staff and the clatter of plates, but everything seemed distant, as if he were in a fog. The pressure of keeping up the facade of a perfect server, always smiling and polite, was becoming unbearable. He had spent so much time trying to please everyone, trying to fit into a mold that never truly suited him, and now it felt like the cracks were starting to show. But what bothered him the most wasn't the couple's rude behavior. It was that he had allowed himself to be affected by it. He had let their attitude chip away at his resolve, and in doing so, he had given up the very thing that he had been working so hard to change. His judgment. The shift had felt like a delicate balance, and now, the weight of his own shortcomings seemed almost unbearable. He wasn't the man he wanted to be. He wasn't sure he knew who he was anymore. As he took a deep breath and forced himself to focus, something caught his eye. A figure, moving through the restaurant like a shadow, caught his attention. It was a woman, but she wasn't like the others. There was something about her, something mysterious and unsettling. She wasn't here to eat, and she wasn't here to socialize. She was just watching. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, methodically, as if she were searching for something. Or someone. The waiter tried to shake off the feeling that something was off. He had seen hundreds of people come and go through those doors, but this woman, dressed in a long coat despite the warmth of the evening, was different. Her eyes met his for a split second, and in that moment, he felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just that she looked at him. There was something in her gaze that made him feel like she knew something about him, something he wasn't ready to face. His pulse quickened as he turned away, trying to push the thought out of his mind. He had enough on his plate already. There was the couple, the growing tension in the air, and the undeniable sense of discomfort that seemed to follow him. But this woman, she had unsettled him in a way that he couldn't explain. Was she a customer? Was she someone's friend? He wasn't sure, but there was no denying the way she seemed to be studying him. The evening continued, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still there, watching him, every time he passed by. He could feel her eyes on him. And when the evening began to slow, with only a few late-night patrons left in the restaurant, she finally approached the bar. The waiter, almost subconsciously, made his way over to her, feeling an odd sense of inevitability. "What can I get you?" he asked, his voice strained, despite his best effort to sound casual. The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing her next words carefully. It was like she was trying to decide something, but he couldn't tell what it was. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "You've been busy tonight, haven't you?" she said, her words almost a statement, not a question. The waiter nodded, but something about her tone made him uneasy. There was an odd certainty in the way she spoke, like she knew more about him than she should. "I've been watching you," she continued, her gaze never leaving his. "You're different from the others." He raised an eyebrow, confused. "Different how?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his nerves were starting to get the better of him. She smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was knowing. "You think you're making changes, but I can see the truth. I can see what's still inside of you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been trying so hard to be better, to prove to himself and others that he wasn't the same person he used to be. But here, in the midst of this woman's gaze, it felt like all that effort had been in vain. His past mistakes, his judgments, his anger, they were still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to come out. Before he could respond, she stood up, her eyes still locked on his. "You're not ready to face it yet, but you will be," she said cryptically. "And when you are, you'll realize how deep it goes." She turned away without another word, leaving the waiter standing at the bar, frozen in place. Her words echoed in his mind, over and over, until they felt like a mantra. "You'll realize how deep it goes." What did she mean by that? How could she know what he was struggling with, what he was trying to overcome? For the rest of the night, the waiter couldn't focus. His mind was consumed with the woman's cryptic words. Who was she? How did she know what was going on inside his head? It was as though she had peeled back the layers of his thoughts, exposing everything he had been trying to bury. As he cleaned up the last of the tables, he felt a sense of dread settle in his chest. He wanted to believe that he was changing, that he was becoming a better person. But now, everything seemed uncertain. His past was coming back to haunt him, and it felt like there was no way to escape it. The woman's sudden appearance, her strange words, and the sense of unease that lingered in the air, it all felt like the beginning of something much bigger, something he wasn't ready for. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he knew he couldn't keep running from his past forever. Eventually, he would have to confront it. And when he did, he had a feeling that it wouldn't just be his own flaws he'd be facing. The next day, as he returned to the restaurant for his shift, the tension in the air seemed even thicker. The woman's words still hung over him like a dark cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something he couldn't control. He walked through the familiar door, but everything felt different now. The restaurant, the people, even the smell of food seemed off. He had no idea how much his life was about to change, but deep down, he could feel it. And with that feeling came the overwhelming realization that he might have just been caught in a web far bigger than he ever imagined. The stage was set, but the true test had only just begun. The days that followed felt like a blur, and the weight of the woman's words continued to hang over the waiter like a dark cloud. He was on edge, his every step in the restaurant filled with uncertainty. His mind was constantly racing, replaying her cryptic warning. "You'll realize how deep it goes." The more he tried to focus on his work, the more distracted he became. The uneasy feeling never left him, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, deep down, he knew something was about to change. Something big was coming, and he couldn't control it. One evening, as the dinner rush began to slow and the restaurant grew quieter, the woman reappeared. This time, she didn't linger in the background. She walked straight up to the bar, where the waiter was cleaning glasses, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the room. He couldn't avoid her any longer. His heart raced as she approached, her expression unreadable. "You've been thinking about what I said, haven't you?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an unsettling certainty. He swallowed hard, nodding. "I've been trying to figure it out. What did you mean by it?" She smiled again, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knew far more than they were letting on. "You're not the only one who's been watching. I've seen the way you've been struggling, the way you've been holding on to your past. But it's not just your judgment that's the problem. It's the way you've been running from it." The words hit him harder than he expected. All this time, he had been trying to change, to break free from the person he used to be. But here she was, telling him he hadn't really confronted anything at all. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she had peeled back all the layers he'd carefully built around himself. The woman leaned in slightly, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You've been hiding from the truth. And sooner or later, it's going to catch up with you." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What truth? What are you talking about?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, as though making sure no one else was listening. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You've been working here for a long time, haven't you? Seen a lot of people come and go. But there's one person you haven't seen, someone who's been here all along." The words were like a slap across his face, and he could feel the room spinning. Who was she talking about? What did she mean? Before he could respond, the woman continued, her gaze unwavering. "You think your past is gone, that you've moved on from who you were. But the truth is, you've been running in circles. There's someone you know, someone close to you. They're the key to everything. And they've been hiding in plain sight." The waiter felt the ground shift beneath him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Someone close to him. Who? Was she talking about a fellow waiter? A regular customer? He couldn't understand. Suddenly, the sound of the restaurant's door opening broke the tension. The waiter turned, instinctively scanning the room, but his eyes froze when they landed on a figure standing in the doorway. It was a familiar face, but one he hadn't seen in years. His heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. The person who had been hiding in plain sight, the one he had never expected to see again, had just walked in. It was his old friend, someone he hadn't thought about in so long that he had buried the memories deep inside himself. The last time they had spoken, things had ended badly. Their friendship had crumbled, and the guilt and anger that followed had caused him to shut that chapter of his life away forever. But here they were, standing in the doorway, looking just as they had before, like nothing had ever happened. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The restaurant's chatter faded into the background, and everything felt muffled, distant. The woman at the bar didn't say a word, but he knew she was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. This was it. The truth. The thing he had been avoiding, running from for so long. His past had come back, and it wasn't just a coincidence. He had been living with the lie, and now the consequences were crashing down on him. He forced himself to take a step toward the door, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He couldn't just ignore this. He couldn't pretend like everything was fine anymore. He had to face what he had been avoiding. As he approached his old friend, the weight of the years between them pressed down on him. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know where to begin. But before he could speak, his friend spoke first. "You've changed," they said, their voice almost soft, but filled with an emotion that was impossible to ignore. "I've watched you try to be someone else, but you can't outrun who you really are." The words hit him harder than anything else. They weren't angry, but there was pain in them, a deep old pain that he had ignored for far too long. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His mind was racing, trying to process everything, but nothing made sense anymore. The woman at the bar had been right. He had been running, trying to outrun his past, trying to reinvent himself, but the truth was that he hadn't dealt with it. He had just buried it, hoping it would go away on its own. But it didn't. It never did. And now, standing in front of him was the one person who knew him better than anyone. The one person who had been there when things fell apart. The one person who could expose everything he had been trying to hide. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words choking him as they left his mouth. His old friend looked at him for a long moment, their eyes softening. "Sorry isn't enough," they said quietly. "But it's a start." The silence between them was deafening. It felt like time had stopped, like everything was suspended in that one moment. And then, finally, the woman who had been watching from the bar stood up and walked toward them. "You're not the only one who has to make amends," she said, her voice low but firm. "But this is your chance, to face your past, to stop running." The waiter looked between the two of them, his old friend and the mysterious woman, and realized something that shook him to his core. They were both part of the same story. They had been there all along, waiting for him to wake up, to stop pretending. But now it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions and finally deal with the truth he had been avoiding for so long. With that, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and he knew that this moment, this confrontation, was only the beginning of something much bigger. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on the waiter's chest. His mind swirled with conflicting thoughts as he stood there between the woman and his old friend. His heart ached with the realization that all this time he had been running from the truth, from his own mistakes, and from the very people who cared for him. It felt as though the universe had conspired to bring them back into his life, to show him the one thing he had avoided facing for so long: the need for accountability. His old friend, the one he had pushed away all those years ago, was standing right in front of him now. The time and distance between them hadn't erased the connection they once shared. In that quiet moment, he could see the hurt in their eyes, the pain of betrayal that had lingered long after their falling out. And the truth stung. He hadn't just hurt them, he had hurt himself too. The person he had become in the aftermath was not the person he wanted to be. "Can we start over?" The words came out almost as a whisper, but they were filled with more sincerity than he could ever remember offering before. His old friend paused, their gaze softening. "I don't know if things can go back to the way they were, but we can move forward, if you're ready." There was a long pause as the waiter let the weight of their words sink in. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about finding a way to make amends, to move past the old mistakes, and to heal. He had been so focused on trying to prove to the world that he had changed that he had neglected the one thing that really mattered: making things right with the people who mattered most. The woman, still standing by, didn't speak at first. She simply watched, her eyes like a mirror reflecting back the emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel. The silence between them felt like an eternity, but it was also a moment of clarity. The waiter realized that this was the turning point in his life, the moment where he could either continue running from the truth or face it head-on and begin to rebuild what he had lost. "I know this isn't easy," the woman finally said, her voice calm but firm. "But sometimes the hardest thing we have to do is face the person we used to be, to stop hiding from our flaws and mistakes and take responsibility for them. You've been running long enough. It's time to own up to your past, so you can build a better future." Her words were like a jolt of electricity running through his veins. He had been so caught up in trying to fit a mold, to pretend he wasn't who he once was, that he had forgotten the power of growth. Change wasn't about hiding from the past. It was about confronting it, learning from it, and using it to fuel a better version of yourself. "I've been running from myself," he admitted quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "From who I used to be. I thought I could just leave all that behind, but I see now that I have to make peace with it. I have to own it." His old friend nodded. their face a mixture of sadness and understanding. It's not about forgetting the past. It's about learning from it, using it to shape who you want to be. We can't change what happened, but we can control how we move forward. The woman stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've got this. You don't have to do it alone. There are people in your life who care about you, who want to see you grow and become the person you've always been capable of becoming. For the first time in what felt like forever, the waiter felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this. He wasn't stuck in a cycle of mistakes and regrets. There was a way forward. It wouldn't be easy, but he now understood that real change wasn't about escaping the past. It was about learning to live with it, to make amends, and to use it as a stepping stone to something better. As the night drew to a close, the tension that had plagued the restaurant seemed to lift. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer held him captive. He had faced his truth, and that alone felt like a victory. There was still a lot of work to do. He knew that. Repairing relationships, rebuilding trust, and proving that he had truly changed wouldn't happen overnight. But he was ready. He was ready to face whatever came next, because for the first time in years, he felt like he was in control of his own story. As he walked to the back of the restaurant, he took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to walk it. The mistakes of his past had shaped him, yes, but they no longer defined him. What mattered now was how he chose to move forward. He had learned a painful lesson about judgment, not just of others, but of himself. And that lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. He smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. It was a small, quiet smile, but it was a start toward healing, toward becoming the person he had always wanted to be. The woman at the bar had been right. He had to stop running. He had to face the truth of who he was, who he had been, and who he wanted to become. As he looked around the empty restaurant, the once familiar setting now felt different. It was as if he were seeing it through new eyes. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could finally be himself. The weight of judgment, both from others and himself, had been lifted. And with that, a new chapter had begun. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace it. The past may have shaped him, but it was the present. And the choices he made from here on out, that would define who he truly was.